Understanding Iran isn't just history, it's the key to understanding Middle Eastern politics today. Why does Iran fund Hezbollah and Hamas? Why did it nearly go to war with the US? Why is it so different from other Muslim countries? Well, the answer goes back 1,400 years to a battlefield in Iraq where 70 people fought against an army and lost, and that defeat created an empire. But let's start from the very beginning. Iran sits at the crossroads of the ancient world. It's a high plateau ringed by mountains. It connects Mesopotamia to Central Asia, the Mediterranean to India. Whoever controlled Iran controlled the trade routes and the flow of ancient civilization itself. Before Persians, they were the Elamites, based around Susa in southwestern Iran. They built a sophisticated civilization that traded with and frequently fought Mesopotamia. They had their own writing system, their own gods, their own way of doing things. The Elamites lasted nearly 3 millennia, longer than most civilizations managed to exist at all. Sometime in the second millennium BC, Iranian-speaking peoples drifted onto the plateau from the north. Two groups matter the most, the Medes and the Persians. The Medes came to prominence first, organizing a kingdom in northwestern Iran. But in 550 BC, Cyrus the Great rebelled against his Median overlord and won. He then built the largest empire the world has ever seen at the time, conquering Lydia, Babylon, where he famously freed the Jews from exile and eventually created an empire stretching from Libya to the Indus River, encompassing perhaps 44 of the world's population. Their religion, however, was Zoroastrianism, and it's often described as the earliest monotheistic religion. Zoroaster preached a dualistic religion, Ahura Mazda, or the wise lord, versus Angra Mainyu, or the destructive spirit, light versus darkness. Achaemenid kings invoked Ahura Mazda constantly, and Zoroastrian elements pervaded their ideology. But the empire's great failure was Greece. Darius's invasion ended at Marathon, and his son tried again. He even burnt Athens, but then lost at Salamis and Plataea. Still, the empire lasted another century until Alexander the Great showed up. Alexander the Great conquered Persia between 334 and 330 BC. After he burned Persepolis and died young, his generals carved up his empire. The Seleucid Empire controlled most of Iran, bringing Greek culture and cities, but ruling over an Iranian population that never fully Hellenized. In the mid-3rd century BC, a group called the Parni established themselves in northeastern Iran and became the Parthians. Over the next century, they pushed the Seleucids out entirely. The Parthians maintained Iranian culture, were Zoroastrian, and innovated with heavy cavalry and mounted archers who perfected the Parthian shot. But after the Parthians, and this is where it starts to connect with modern Iran, came the Sassanids. In 224 AD, Ardashir I rebelled against the Parthians and won, and he was claiming descent from the Achaemenids. His Sasanian empire centralized power like the Parthians never had, and so Zoroastrianism became closer to a state religion. The priests codified the Avesta and established orthodoxy, although Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism all existed within the empire. For centuries, Iran's western neighbor had been its greatest rival. The Parthians had fought Rome to a bloody stalemate. Now the Sasanians would pick up where they left off, but with far more ambition. They wanted to reclaim everything Alexander had taken, everything Rome now held: Syria, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the old Achaemenid territories. The Sasanian-Roman or later Byzantine wars defined late antiquity. Shapur I captured Roman Emperor Valerian, the only time a Roman emperor was captured in battle. But the most dramatic conflict came in the end. Khosrow II conquered Syria, Egypt, and reached Constantinople's walls. But Byzantine Emperor Heraclius counterattacked and won decisively. Both empires were very exhausted. Now, around all this time, In Arabia, a new religion was emerging. Muhammad died in 632 AD, and within 2 decades, his Arab followers had conquered the exhausted Sasanian Empire. The speed was shocking. The Arabs defeated the Sasanians decisively at Qasidiya in 636 and Nahawand in 642. By 651, the last Sasanian king was dead, murdered while fleeing. Why did it happen so fast? Well, the Sasanian Empire was bankrupt financially and militarily. Decades of war with Byzantium had drained everything. The aristocracy was divided, and many Iranians, especially non-Zoroastrians, saw the Arabs as potential liberators from heavy taxation. The Arabs offered lower taxes to those who converted, and they didn't immediately force conversion. But make no mistake, this was conquest, and it ended Iranian political independence for over a millennium. To understand what happened next, which is extremely important in Iranian history, you need to understand Islam's first great division, a split that began almost immediately after the death of Muhammad, and it still shapes the Middle East today. When Muhammad died, he left no explicit succession plan, although Shia Muslims have a different opinion. More on that in a second. Most of Muhammad's followers chose Abu Bakr, one of his earliest companions, as the first caliph, which means successor. Then came Umar, then Uthman, but a significant minority believed Muhammad had designated his cousin and son-in-law Ali as his successor. Those became the Shi'at Ali, which means the party of Ali or Shias. Ali finally became the fourth caliph in 656, but his rule was contested, violent, and brief. He was assassinated, and power passed to Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, who moved the capital to Damascus. The Umayyads were pragmatic empire builders, but to Ali's supporters, they were usurpers who had stolen what belonged to the Prophet's family. Here's where doctrine diverges. Sunnis believe the caliphate should go to the most qualified Muslim, which the community agrees on. Shias believe leadership, or the imamate, belongs exclusively to the descendants of Ali through Muhammad's daughter Fatima. For Shias, the imam isn't just a political leader, he's a divinely guided figure and the only legitimate interpreter of Islam's inner meaning. So, after Ali died, as we said, power passed to Muawiyah. To avoid civil war, Ali's elder son, Hassan, negotiated a deal. He would recognize Muawiyah as caliph, but after Muawiyah's death, the caliphate would return to the Prophet's family, to Hassan or his brother Hussein, both the sons of Ali. At first, Muawiyah agreed. Then years later, he broke the agreement and he designated his own son Yazid as his successor, turning the caliphate into a hereditary monarchy. When Muawiyah died, the Umayyads expected everyone to fall in line. By this time, Hassan was dead, so Ali's second son, Hussein, refused to acknowledge the Umayyad caliph Yazid. Hussein received letters from Kufa in Iraq claiming thousands would support him. So he set out from Mecca with about 70 followers, including family and companions, towards Kufa. This was a catastrophic miscalculation because by the time Hussein reached Karbala, the Kufans had abandoned him because they were intimidated by the Umayyad governor. An army of thousands surrounded Hussein's tiny band. They cut off access to water. On the 10th of the Islamic month of Muharram, they attacked. The battle, if you can call it that, was a carnage. Hussein's men fought with bravery, but they couldn't win. Hussein watched his sons die, his brothers die, his nephews die. Finally, wounded and exhausted, he was killed. The women and children were taken captive to Damascus. This battle at Karbala became the defining trauma of Shia Islam. It's not just a historical event to them because it's a sacred narrative of martyrdom, of standing against overwhelming injustice, of sacrifice for truth. Of course, this is from the Shia point of view. Every year, Shias commemorate Ashura, which is the day of Hussein's death, with mourning processions. The cry, "Every day is Ashura, every land is Karbala," captures how the 7th century event remains perpetually present in Shia spirituality. The core message is that legitimate authority was violently suppressed by illegitimate power. True believers must remain loyal to the Imam's line, even in defeat, even in hiding, until justice is restored. Shias developed a sophisticated theology centered on the role of the Imam. Sunni Islam is relatively straightforward. You have to follow the Quran, you have to follow Muhammad's example laid out in the Hadith, you have to obey Islamic law as interpreted by scholars. Shias accept all of these things but add another layer, the Imam, who to Shias is the key to everything. For Shias, reality has two levels, the apparent or zahir and the hidden or batin. The Quran has an exoteric meaning anyone can read, but also an esoteric meaning only the Imam can unlock. The Prophet brought the letter of revelation. The Imam reveals its spirit. Without the interpretation of the Imam, you're stuck with the surface. This makes the Imam, first of whom, Ali, cosmically important because he's not just a political leader, but also a spiritual guide, basically a channel between God and humanity. He bears secret divine knowledge passed down from Ali. The Imams possess supernatural knowledge, miraculous powers, direct communication with angels. They are infallible, and knowing them is knowing God, or at least what can be known of God. From Ali onward, the imamate passed through his descendants, Hassan, Hussein, the 9 more descendants of Hussein. The 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, supposedly went into occultation or hiding as a child. 12 Shias believe he's still alive, hidden by God, and will return at the end of time as the Mahdi, the Messianic Redeemer, who will establish perfect justice. Until then, quietism. For centuries, most Shia scholars taught that legitimate government died with the Imams. Any power before the Mahdi's return is inherently illegitimate. Believers should avoid politics, endure injustice patiently, practice taqiyya, which is concealing one's faith when threatened, and wait. Any banner raised before the Mahdi belongs to a rebel against God. This was theology of permanent opposition, of mystical devotion to an absent savior. So how did this esoteric, quietist sect produce the Islamic Republic of Iran? Let's look at the history. So, as we said, the Umayyads took the caliphate, but the Umayyads fell in 750 to the Abbasid revolution. Many Shias initially supported this uprising, hoping the Abbasids, who were also from the Prophet's family, descendants of Muhammad's uncle Abbas, would favor them. But the Abbasids quickly disappointed Shia expectations, and they established their own Sunni caliphate in Baghdad, and sometimes even persecuted Shia communities even more systematically than the Umayyads had. During Abbasid rule, the Shia Imams lived under intense surveillance in Iraq. They were scholarly figures who taught quietly, developing Shia theology and law while avoiding open confrontation with the Abbasid authorities. Most of them died young. Many Shias believe they died by poisoning. In 874, the 11th Imam died, and his young son, the 12th Imam, disappeared. Shias believe he went into occultation or ghaiba, first communicating through representatives, which is the lesser occultation, then ceasing all contact, which is the greater occultation. This created a theological crisis. Without the Imam physically present, who could legitimately rule? The emergent consensus, as we said, that no government was truly legitimate until the hidden Imam returned as the Mahdi. Now back to Iran. There were 3 brothers from the mountains, the Buyids. Their names were Ali, Hassan, and Ahmad, and they came from Dailam, the rugged highlands south of the Caspian Sea. This was 12er Shia country, isolated enough to have kept its faith, while much of the rest of the Islamic world remained Sunni. The mountain men were tough, independent, and believers. By the early 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was a hollow shell. The caliphs in Baghdad had become puppets of their own Turkish slave soldier guards. Real power belonged to whoever could command an army, and the three Buyid brothers definitely could command armies. They carved out territories across western Iran and Iraq. Ahmad ibn Buya marched into Baghdad itself in 945. He couldn't overthrow the caliph because the symbolic weight was too great and most Muslims were still Sunni, so he did something clever. He forced the caliph to make him commander of commanders and bow to his authority. A Shia warlord now controlled the Sunni caliphate. This created the first Shia state in history and immediately a theological crisis. Classical Shia doctrine clearly says any government before Mahdi's return is illegitimate. Believers should withdraw, wait, endure. But here we had Shia power needing intellectual legitimacy. The rationalist scholars in Baghdad, Sheikh al-Mufid and his brilliant student al-Sharif al-Murtada bent the rules. They introduced reason as a source of law alongside tradition. They developed ijtihad, which is independent legal reasoning by qualified jurists. And crucially, they began positioning themselves as representatives of the hidden imam. Since the imam was absent, but believers needed guidance, qualified jurists would fill the voids, not with the imam's infallibility, but with learned interpretation. Now, the seed was planted, that of the clergy being the deputy of the imam, wielding practical authority in his absence. The Buyids fell in the mid-11th century to the Turks, the Seljuk Turks, who were militantly Sunni. For the next 5 centuries, Iran was ruled by Sunni dynasties. Seljuks, Mongols when they converted to Islam, and Timurids. Shia Islam survived in the margins, scattered communities, mystical Sufi orders, esoteric believers concealing their faith, but most Iranians were actually Sunni. But in the region of Azerbaijan, in the mountains of northwestern Iran, something was brewing. A Sufi sheikh, Safi ad-Din, established a mystical order, a tariqah, that attracted followers through its spiritual intensity and the charisma of its leader. The Safaviya order, as it became known, was Sunni, like most of Iran. Its followers practiced Sufi disciplines, meditation, isolation, devotion to the sheikh as a living saint who could intercede with God. This mystical order grew, and Safi ad-Din's successors inherited both his spiritual authority and his growing following. Now, this wasn't really unusual. Sufi orders were everywhere in the medieval Islamic world, offering spiritual comfort and community in an age of political chaos. But what made the Safaviya special was its location and its followers. Azerbaijan sat at a crossroads between the sedentary Persian-speaking population and the nomadic Turkmen tribes who had been moving into the region for centuries. The Safaviya order, or the Safavid, attracted both, but especially the Turkmen warriors. By the late 14th century, something was shifting. The order was becoming more militant, more political. Sheikh Junaid, who led the order in the mid-15th century, transformed it from a contemplative Sufi brotherhood into something closer to a holy warrior movement. He married into the ruling family of the Ak Koyunlu, one of the major powers in the region, who were Turkmen, and he led his followers, now called the Qizilbash, which means redheads, on raids into the Caucasus against Christian kingdoms, framing it as jihad or holy war. He was also moving the order towards Shia Islam, not the rationalist, legalistic Shia Islam of the jurists, but an ecstatic, esoteric Shia Islam, an extreme Sufi mysticism. The Qizilbash began venerating Ali not just as the rightful successor to Muhammad, but as an almost divine figure, perhaps even an incarnation of God. They saw their sheikh or leader not as a mere spiritual guide, but as a living manifestation of divine power, possibly the awaited Mahdi. Orthodox Muslims, Sunnis and Shia alike called this ghulu, or exaggeration, and considered it heretical. The Qizilbash didn't care. Their devotion was absolute. Their leader, Sheikh Junaid, died fighting in 1460. His son, Haidar, continued the transformation, making the Shia identity even more explicit and the military organization even tighter. The Qizilbash were now a formidable fighting force, thousands of devoted warriors who believed their sheikh was divinely appointed and that dying for him guaranteed paradise. Haidar also died in battle in 1488, fighting the Ak Koyunlu, who had grown alarmed at Safavid power. Haidar had a son, Ismail, and when Haidar died, Ismail was orphaned at age 1. The Ak Koyunlu hunted the Safavid family, and so Ismail was hidden and he was protected by loyal followers, his very existence a secret. He grew up hearing stories of his father and grandfather, surrounded by Qizilbash warriors who believed he was destined for greatness. In 1499, at age 12, Ismail emerged from hiding. The Qizilbash flocked to him. Contemporary sources describe their devotion as manic. They believed he was invincible, that he could work miracles, that God spoke through him, and Ismail believed it too, or at least performed the role brilliantly. He wrote poetry in Azeri Turkish, claiming his almost divine status, comparing himself to Ali, hinting he might be God incarnate. Ismail's poetry invoked themes of justice, fighting to avenge Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt, or the family of the Prophet. With this fanatical army behind him, Ismail moved fast. In 1501, at age 14, he captured Tabriz, the wealthy capital of Azerbaijan and one of the greatest cities of the East. He proclaimed himself Shah, not just of Azerbaijan, but of Iran, and he declared Twelver Shia Islam the religion of his new state. This was a revolution. Iran had been Sunnis for so long, and there was no Shia infrastructure and no established Iranian Shia scholarship. Barely any Shia population outside of scattered communities on the peripheries of Iran. Ismail didn't care. He would create a Shia Iran by force. He ordered public cursing of the first 3 caliphs, the most important figures in Sunni Islam after Muhammad and the prophets. He forced conversions and he massacred Sunni scholars who resisted. He imported Shia clerics from Lebanon, Bahrain, and southern Iraq, places where Shia Islam was more established, to staff mosques, to teach in schools, and to train a new generation of Iranian Shia believers. The most important of these imported scholars was a guy called Ali al-Karaki, known as Muhaqqaq al-Thani, born in Jabal Amil, in what is now Lebanon. Karaki was a brilliant jurist, trained in both Shia and Sunni law. Shah Ismail officially honored him and granted him land, but Karaki's real power came under Ismail's son, Shah Tahmasp. Tahmasp gave Karaki 2 titles that changed everything. The first one is Na'ib al-Imam, which means deputy of the Imam, and the second one was Khatam al-Mujtahideen, which means the seal of the jurists. These weren't just honorifics. These meant that Karaki spoke with the authority of the hidden Imam himself and stood above all other legal scholars. Karaki used his authority systematically, and he traveled throughout Iran, establishing Shia practice, appointing prayer leaders in cities and villages. He declared that Friday prayers, traditionally forbidden during the Imam's absence, could be held if led by a qualified jurist acting as the deputy of the Imam. That jurist, of course, was him. This was a revolution. Classical Shia doctrine said these functions belonged exclusively to the Imam and must remain suspended until his return. Karaki said no. Qualified jurists inherit these functions during the occultation, not the Imam's infallibility or supernatural knowledge, but his practical authority. which means to interpret law, to lead prayers, to collect taxes. These are the same premises of the ideology of the guardianship of the jurist, or vilayat-e-faqih in Farsi, which is the ruling ideology of the current Islamic Republic of Iran. Karaki also worked to suppress the heterodox beliefs of the Qizilbash. He condemned Sufi practices that contradicted Shia orthodoxy. He also promoted the public cursing of Abu Bakr and Umar, who were the first two caliphs revered by Sunnis, and he made anti-Sunni Islam a defining feature of Iranian identity of the time. He provided the Safavids with ideological defense against the Ottoman Empire, which denounced them as heretics. Karaki died in 1533, but his legacy was permanent. His descendants held positions as judges, prayer leaders, and chief administrators for generations. Most importantly, he established a template, the Shia jurist as the deputy of the Imam, wielding religious and political authority, collaborating with temporal power. During the Safavid period, the Shia clergy built a parallel power structure independent of the state. The Safavid dynasty collapsed in 1722 to Afghan invaders. Iran descended into chaos, but the clerical infrastructure the Safavids had built, the seminaries, the network of scholars, the system of religious taxes, survived independently of any governments. Eventually, the Qajar dynasty restored order. The Qajars were actually descendants from one of the original 7 Qizilbash tribes, but eventually they became weak rulers of a weakening state. And by the 19th century, Iran was caught between two empires, Russia expanding south, and Britain protecting its route to India. The Qajars survived by playing them off each other, selling concessions to raise cash, and watching their country slowly dissolve. The ulama, or the clergy, meanwhile, had grown stronger. They didn't need the state anymore. They had their own funding from religious taxes, their own institutions, and their own hierarchy of senior scholars. Some collaborated with the Shah, others opposed them, but their authority came from below, from people, from the believers who paid them and followed the rulings, not from above. By 1890, the Qajar state was bankrupt. Shah Nasruddin sold a concession to a British company, a 50-year monopoly over Iran's entire tobacco production, sale, and export. Everyone in Iran was outraged. Merchants saw their livelihoods threatened. Ordinary Iranians hated foreign control over something they used daily, and the ulama saw an opportunity. Protests began in 1891. Merchants closed the bazaars. Preachers denounced the concession. Then Grand Ayatollah Mirza Hassan Shirazi, the most respected religious authority, issued a fatwa: using tobacco is forbidden until the concession is cancelled. Fatwas have religious weight, so using tobacco in Iran became haram. And the effect was instantaneous. Across Iran, millions of people stopped smoking. In the royal palace, the Shah's own wives refused to use the hookah. Even the Shah himself couldn't find a servant willing to prepare his water pipe. The tobacco trade collapsed overnight. Within weeks, the Shah capitulated and cancelled the concession. This changed everything. The ulama had flexed their power and won without firing a shot. A single religious decree from a scholar had paralyzed the government. The lesson was obvious. When united, the clergy commanded more loyalty than the Shah. Their authority came from faith, and no one, not even the king, could disobey when they framed something as a religious duty. 15 years later, Iran became unstable again. The causes were very similar: economic collapse, royal corruption, foreign domination. But this time the demands went further: not just cancel a concession, but limit the power of the Shah itself. The constitutional revolution forced the Qajar Shah to accept a parliament, a constitution, and rule of law. It was Iran's first experiment with a representative government, but the ulama, or the clergy, were divided. Some supported constitutionalism as a check on tyranny. Others, like Ayatollah Fazlullah Nuri, opposed it as Western heresy because for him, who needs elected representatives where God has already provided Islamic law? The revolution succeeded briefly, then failed. The new Shah staged a coup with Russian backing. Civil war followed. The pro-constitution retook Tehran in 1909, but Russia and Britain had already carved Iran into spheres of influence and were intervening directly. By 1911, the revolution was effectively crushed. But something permanent had shifted because the 1907 supplementary constitution included a clause giving senior religious clerics veto power over legislation to ensure it didn't contradict Islamic law. It was never really implemented, but the principle was established. In a proper Islamic state, the ulama must have institutional power to enforce God's law or Sharia. And so the seeds of 1979 were planted in 1907. The constitutional revolution left Iran weak and divided. Then came World War I. Iran declared neutrality, but nobody really cared. Russian, British, Ottoman, and German armies all fought on Iranian soil, requisitioning food, destroying infrastructure, and treating the country like it didn't exist. The result was apocalyptic. The Persian famine killed between 500,000 people and 2 million people, roughly 8 to 20% of the population of Iran. And it was due to occupation, requisitioned harvests, droughts, and a British naval blockade preventing grain imports. By 1920, Iran was very poor. Separatist movements threatened in multiple provinces, and the Qajar government barely controlled Tehran. The British were negotiating a treaty that would have made Iran a protectorate. The country was on the verge of a complete disintegration. Iranian nationalists were desperate. The country needed a strong government and a functioning army, and the Qajars couldn't provide it. Enter Riza Khan. Riza Khan was born around 1877 in Mazandaran. He was orphaned by age 6 and grew up poor and illiterate. His only opportunity was the Persian Cossack Brigade, Iran's only effective military force, trained and officered by Russians. He was large, he was physically intimidating, he was personally austere and fiercely capable, and he rose through the ranks on merit. In February 1921, with British support, Riza Khan marched his Cossack troops into Tehran. The Qajar government was too weak to resist, so he took command of the army, he crushed separatist movements, and brought tribal chiefs to heel. By 1925, the parliament voted to depose the Qajars entirely. Riza Khan crowned himself Riza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty. The name was deliberate. Pahlavi referenced the language of the ancient Sasanian Empire, which was some sort of a claim to pre-Islamic Persian glory. Riza Shah positioned himself as the man who would restore Iranian greatness after centuries of weakness and humiliation. His model was Ataturk's Turkey, secular, modernizing, authoritarian, and nationalist. He built roads, railways, schools, he founded Tehran University, he banned the veil or the hijab, and forced men to wear Western clothes. He subordinated the clergy ruthlessly, and he executed dissenters. In 1935, troops fired on protesters at the shrine in Mashhad, killing dozens. The clergy hated him, but he was too strong to resist. When World War II began in 1939, Riza Shah had been actually courting Germany for years, using German companies to avoid dependence on Britain and Russia. And once Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Allies couldn't tolerate a potentially pro-Axis Iran sitting on supply routes to the Soviet Union. British and Soviet forces invaded. Riza Shah's military collapsed without a fight, and the Allies demanded he abdicate. He had no choice. In September 1941, he left for exile, eventually dying in Johannesburg in 1944. The British settled on Riza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Mohammad Reza was crowned in September 1941, but he wasn't really in charge. British forces occupied the south and Soviets the north. The young Shah had almost no power. The Allies agreed to withdraw 6 months after the war ended. World War II ended in August 1945, so the British withdrew from Iran, but the Soviets didn't. Stalin had plans for northern Iran. In late 1945, Soviet forces helped create two puppet states, the Azerbaijan People's Government in Tabriz and the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. These were designed to either detach territory or pressure Tehran into submission. Mohammad Reza Shah did something clever. He invited American forces to Iran and appealed to President Truman. He wanted an American presence to counterbalance the Soviets and the British. The Americans, newly committed to containing Soviet expansion, responded, and so under American pressure, Stalin agreed to withdraw. Once the Soviets left, Iranian forces crushed both separatist governments, and this was one of the first confrontations of the Cold War, and it started in Iran. The young Shah saw America as Iran's savior, and the Americans saw Iran as a critical buffer against Soviet expansion into the Middle East. This alliance would shape the next 3 decades, and its betrayal would shape what came after. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Iranian oil had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, essentially British state property. The terms were obscene. The company generated enormous revenue. Iran received barely anything while British managers lived in luxury and Iranian workers had degrading conditions. This was pure colonial exploitation. Iranians knew what was possible. In 1950, American companies had agreed to split profits 50-50 with Saudi Arabia. Iran wanted the same, but the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company refused. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a Qajar aristocrat, holder of a law doctorate, and one of the few politicians who had opposed Reza Khan's power grab in the 1920s. By 1950, he led the National Front, which was a coalition of nationalists, liberals, and religious figures united against foreign domination. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In April, under pressure, the Shah appointed Mossadegh prime minister, and he went to the Abadan refinery, which was the world's largest refinery, and took it over in the name of the Iranian people. The British imposed a naval blockade. They organized an international boycott and froze Iranian assets. No company would help Iran refine or sell oil. No tanker would transport it. No buyer would purchase it. Iran's oil revenue stopped and the economy collapsed. Mossadegh held firm. This was about sovereignty. To him, this was about Iran's right to control its own resources. But the pressure was devastating. His coalition fractured, and the religious conservatives grew wary. The merchants were worried about chaos, and the Shah quietly worked against him. The British convinced the new American president, Eisenhower, that Mossadegh was paving the way for communism. In August 1953, the CIA and the MI6 orchestrated Operation Ajax. The first attempt failed. The Shah fled to Rome thinking it was over, but after chaotic days, military units on the CIA payroll arrested Mossadegh, and the coup succeeded. He was sentenced to prison and then house arrest until his death in 1967. The Shah returned in triumph, but everyone knew the Americans had put him back. Whatever legitimacy he might have claimed evaporated in August 1953. The oil dispute was resolved in 1954. A consortium of Western companies took over operations. Iran got better terms, and officially the National Iranian Oil Company owned the oil, but real control remained foreign. Nationalization had failed. The lesson many Iranians learned that secular nationalism wasn't enough to protect Iran. Democracy could be overthrown and the Americans couldn't be trusted. More importantly, the Shah was now just a puppet. Among those watching and learning was a relatively obscure cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini. After 1953, Mohammad Reza Shah was firmly in power. Backed by the Americans, He had learned his lesson. Never again would he tolerate a strong prime minister or an independent parliament. Over the next decade, he systematically centralized power. He built up Savak, the secret police trained by the CIA and the Mossad, which became notorious for surveillance, torture, and suppression of dissent. He marginalized political parties, he rigged elections, and he turned the parliament into a rubber stamp. He also continued his father's modernization program, now funded by increasing oil revenues. So roads, dams, factories, schools, hospitals. Iran was developing rapidly, but the development was uneven, authoritarian, and culturally disorienting to many Iranians. The capital, Tehran, boomed, while villages stagnated. The middle class grew, but had no political voice. Western culture flooded in music, films, fashion. It thrilled some Iranians, but it horrified many others, namely religious Iranians and the religious establishment. In the early 1960s, the Shah launched the White Revolution, a top-down modernization program that included land reform, women's suffrage, and expanded education. These were genuinely progressive policies in some way, but they threatened powerful interests. The land reform broke up large estates, including vast properties held by religious endowments that funded the clergy. And women's suffrage and expanded female education challenged conservative religious values. Secular education reduced the clergy's control over young minds. The clergy was furious, and in June, then relatively unknown cleric Ruhollah Khomeini delivered a speech in Qom attacking the Shah, comparing him to the tyrant Yazid who'd killed Hussein at Karbala. The message was clear. The Shah was an oppressor, and resisting him was a religious duty. Khomeini was arrested, riots broke out, and the army suppressed him violently. Hundreds, possibly thousands, killed. Khomeini was released, then arrested again, and then he was exiled, first to Turkey, then to Najaf in Iraq, where he would remain for 13 years. The Shah thought he'd neutralized the threat, but he was wrong. In Najaf, Khomeini was teaching, writing, developing his radical doctrine of vilayat-e-faqih, that jurists should rule. The Shah pressured Saddam Hussein to expel Khomeini from Najaf. Saddam compiled, and he had his own reasons to want Khomeini gone. In October 1978, Khomeini was forced out of Iraq. He went to France and settled in a suburb of Paris. This turned out to be a catastrophic mistake by the Shah. In France, Khomeini had access to international media, direct phone lines to Iran, and freedom to organize. He gave interviews to Le Monde, to the BBC, and other major outlets. He issued statements. He coordinated the revolution from a comfortable house in the French countryside. Cassette tapes of his speeches were smuggled into Iran and played in mosques across the country. Paris was a far better base for overthrowing the Shah than isolated Najaf had ever been. Meanwhile, back in Iran, the perfect storm was brewing. American President Jimmy Carter began pushing the Shah on human rights. The Shah eased repression slightly, and paradoxically, this created space for protests to emerge. Economic recession hit after years of boom. Oil revenues had created wild inflation. The working class suffered as the cost of living soared, while wages stagnated. Secular intellectuals, leftists, and some nationalists who had been organized underground for years saw an opening. The bazaar merchants, traditionally powerful economic actors, were furious about economic policies favoring Western firms and the Shah's cronies. Cheap foreign imports were undercutting their businesses, and the mosques, the one institution Savak couldn't fully control, became centers of organization. In September 1978, a government newspaper published an article insulting Khomeini. Seminary students in Qom protested. Police opened fire, killing several, and this triggered the cycle that would bring down the regime. Islamic tradition holds memorial services on the 40th day after death. Each memorial became a new protest. Each protest brought more deaths, and each death meant another memorial. 40 days later, the movement grew exponentially. By autumn, millions were in the streets. Oil workers struck, crippling the economy and cutting off the regime's financial lifeline. The army wavered. Conscripts didn't want to shoot their own people, and some units began to defect. The entire country became ungovernable. The revolution wasn't technically the creation of Khomeini, but he captured it because multiple groups were rebelling. Marxists, leftists who wanted a socialist Iran, liberal Democrats, and nationalists who wanted parliamentary democracy, students seeking freedom, and younger clerics challenging the secularism of the Shah. But Khomeini had unique advantages. He was uncompromising and he'd been exiled. He had never collaborated with the regime, and he demanded the complete removal of the Shah, not just reform. So his exile gave him the aura of a martyr hero. As a senior cleric, he could mobilize the mosques and speak with a religious authority that no secular leader could match. He was vague enough talking about Islamic government without details so that everyone could project their hopes onto him. Leftists thought he would support social justice. Liberals thought he'd step aside after the Shah fell. And many nationalists saw him as anti-imperialist. And crucially, thanks to his base around Paris, he suddenly had international visibility. The Shah tried everything in his final months, appointing a new prime minister, promising reforms, declaring martial law, even reaching out to opposition leaders. Nothing worked. The momentum was unstoppable. Iran was in revolutionary upheaval, and in January 1979, the Shah fled Iran for medical treatment, though everyone knew he was never coming back. He would spend his final years in exile, dying of cancer in Egypt in 1980. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returned in triumph to Tehran, greeted by millions who lined the street from the airport. The Islamic Republic was born, though few understood yet what that would mean. In the coming months, Khomeini would outmaneuver his secular and leftist allies, establishing the theocratic system he had envisioned in Najaf. The revolution that had united so many different groups would soon consume many of its own children. A new era for Iran has begun.